They thought they had cornered me in one cold Friday meeting. After more than 2 decades of loyalty, they slid an ultimatum across the table and expected me to crumble, politely resign now, or be terminated on the spot. They assumed a middle-aged woman who had spent most of her life inside one company would be too shaken to fight back. They were wrong. I agreed to resign. But I wrote the letter myself. And I wrote it with one sentence that changed everything. A few days later, their corporate attorney called me just after sunrise. His voice tense. Because he had finally understood what the executives in that room had missed. What they believed was, my surrender was actually the beginning of their most expensive mistake. I can still feel the chill of that afternoon when a single sentence nearly severed an entire chapter of my life. They told me to sign a resignation letter or be terminated immediately. There was no real choice in the room. Only pressure dressed up as procedure. 4 executives sat across from me with the quiet confidence of people who believed they had already decided my fate. They expected fear. They expected compliance. They expected a woman in her 40s. After giving so many years to one company, to fold beneath polished language and expensive suits, but I had lived through too much to confuse authority with intelligence. I knew that the most dangerous moments in corporate life rarely came with shouting. They came with neatly prepared documents, calm voices, and the expectation that you would sign away your rights because you were too stunned to resist. So when I said I would resign, I watched relief spread across their faces. They thought they had won. What they did not understand was that I had not agreed to lose. I had simply chosen to enter the fight on paper rather than in panic. The resignation letter I handed over was not an act of surrender. It was a legal mechanism, carefully built in advance, waiting for them to accept it without understanding the consequences. By the time their attorney called me in a strained voice a few mornings later, the truth had already landed. They had made a catastrophic mistake. And they had made it because they underestimated me. My name is Claire Bennett. By then, I was old enough not to be dazzled by titles, and experienced enough to recognize the rhythm of a corporate purge long before most people heard the first footsteps. I was the senior director of global operations at Northbridge Systems, a software company serving manufacturing clients with enterprise management platforms. I had joined when I was still young enough to believe hard work would always be noticed, and loyalty would always matter. Over the years, I became the person people called when something important broke, stalled, or vanished into the cracks of the organization. If an executive forgot the history of a major client account, they called me. If finance needed records from years ago that nobody else could locate, they called me. If the board wanted to know why a certain process existed or which compromise had shaped a key contract, I was the person who could answer. I did not just manage operations, I carried the institutional memory of the company. I knew which vendor relationships required diplomacy, which legacy systems were unstable beneath the surface, and which past mistakes had cost the company more than anyone wanted to admit. That kind of knowledge is invisible until it is gone. And that is why people in power so often undervalue it. When the new regime came in, what hurt most was not the threat of losing my job. It was watching them treat decades of experience as if it were just an overly expensive line item they could erase. The day Sterling Corporate Group acquired Northbridge Systems, I did not need much time to understand what was coming. I had seen this pattern before in other companies across the industry. It always began the same way. Fresh leadership arrived with sleek presentations, optimistic slogans, and carefully rehearsed promises about continuity, culture, and stability. They told everyone nothing essential would change. They said they valued the people who had built the company. They insisted the acquisition was about strengthening what already worked. But people who have spent enough years inside real organizations learn to hear the warning underneath the reassurance. I sat in that meeting and listened to Ethan Cole talk about a strong, shared future. And all I could think was that they would start by cutting the most expensive, most seasoned, and most difficult to manipulate employees first. People like me. People over 40. People with strong contracts, sharp memories, and enough judgment to recognize corporate theater when we saw it. That night, I updated my resume and then began doing something even more important. I started building my record. If you are listening to my story right now, comment the number 1 below so I know you understand that in the workplace, Protecting yourself can matter just as much as performing well. I backed up emails, process documents, vendor history, internal correspondence, rôle description, and every sign that something was shifting beneath the surface. I was not acting out of panic. I was acting out of clarity. I knew that when companies like this move against you, the first thing they try to take is not your desk. It is your ability to prove what you did, what you were owed, and how they treated you. From that point on, I lived in two parallel realities. On the outside, I remained exactly who I had always been. I showed up on time, solved operational problems, guided my team, signed off on plans, and kept critical processes moving. But privately, I was building a fortress of documentation. I preserved every email that used vague language about fresh perspectives and organizational efficiency. I tracked every change in reporting structure, every unexplained shift in responsibility, and every sign that older, higher-paid employees were being targeted under the cover of strategy. I stored everything in multiple encrypted locations outside the company. That was not paranoia. It was professional self-defense. I had watched enough acquisitions to know how quickly access disappears after termination. One meeting, one badge deactivation, one locked account. And suddenly your history belongs to the people rewriting it. I refused to let that happen to me. While others were still trying to believe the promises, I was preparing for the moment those promises collapsed. The strange thing is that the more I documented, the calmer I became. Every preserved file made me feel less dependent on the goodwill of people who clearly had none. My father used to say that workers often lose not because they are wrong, but because they cannot prove what happened. Once someone more powerful starts twisting the story, that lesson stayed with me every night as I backed up records and labeled folders. I did not know exactly when they would come for me. I only knew that when they did, I would not walk out empty-handed, carrying nothing but hurt and a story no one could verify. The first wave of terminations arrived quickly, and it confirmed everything I feared. Within weeks of the acquisition closing, the people being pushed out shared the same profile so clearly that no honest person could call it coincidence. They were older. They were experienced. They were paid well. Their years of contribution were reduced to cold internal language about alignment and restructuring. I watched familiar faces leave with stunned expressions, carrying boxes in disbelief. And something inside me hardened. Nobody said the pattern aloud in official settings, but everyone with eyes could see it. Expertise was being valued less than obedience. Deep knowledge was being traded for cheaper labor. People who had held the company together through difficult years were suddenly treated like financial inefficiencies. I started logging dates, tes rôles, likely salary ranges, replacements, and timing, detail by detail. I stopped hoping I might somehow be spared. Instead, I prepared for my turn with a level of care that bordered on ritual. Still, I kept performing at a high level. I wanted no stain on my record and no opening for them to distort the narrative later. And if you have ever seen something deeply unfair happen at work, please like this video. Because sometimes one honest story can help someone else avoid the same trap. Those months taught me something brutal. Competence alone does not protect you during a soulless acquisition. Clean records, proof, and discipline do. The more I watched seasoned employees replaced by people who did not yet understand the systems they were inheriting, the more I realized I was not preparing to keep my position. I was preparing for the fight that would begin the moment they tried to take it from me. After the first cuts, they shifted tactics with me instead of moving directly. They began weakening my position piece by piece, hoping I would become frustrated enough to leave on my own. Meetings I had led for years suddenly happened without me. Decisions affecting my department were made elsewhere and handed down as if I were merely an implementer. Critical responsibilities were reassigned to Tyler Grant, a younger manager with energy and ambition, but almost no understanding of the legacy infrastructure our business still depended on every day. I did not blame him. He was not the architect of the strategy. He was simply useful to the people trying to prove that long experience could be swapped out without consequence. In one department meeting, they openly questioned whether my judgment still aligned with modern operating models. It sounded technical on the surface. But anyone who has spent real time in corporate life knows what language like that is designed to do. It is meant to age you in public. It is meant to make you look outdated without the speaker having to say the word. I sat there with a steady face and understood exactly what they wanted. They wanted me angry. They wanted me emotional. They wanted me to resign before they had to pay to remove me. But I gave them none of that. I kept showing up. I kept doing the work with precision. My file was spotless after decades of service. No discipline. No poor reviews. No real cause. I knew they were trying to rewrite how others saw me. So I became even more careful about how I carried myself. When an organization tries to make you doubt your own value, one of the strongest forms of resistance is simply refusing to bend. By mid-year, they tried a more aggressive move. Mason Reed called me into his office late on a Friday, which is the kind of timing no experienced employee ever mistakes for good news. He told me that my current position was being eliminated as part of operational restructuring, but that I was welcome to apply for a newly created role with a lower title and a dramatically reduced salary. It was essentially the same work with less pay, less authority, and less dignity. As he spoke, I did not need any further explanation. This was not an opportunity. It was constructive dismissal dressed up as strategy. They wanted me to accept a diminished version of my own job so they could later say everything had been voluntary. I smiled, told him I needed time to consider it, and then went straight home and called Rebecca Sterling, the employment attorney I had quietly retained months earlier when the warning signs became impossible to ignore. Rebecca was direct from the beginning. She said this was a textbook attempt to force me out without bearing the full cost of doing so. If I accepted, I would weaken my own leverage. From that point forward, we reviewed everything. Severance language, bonus provision, equity treatment after a change in control, protections tied to termination after acquisition. The more we examined, the clearer the structure became. I was not imagining what was happening. I was seeing it correctly, and that clarity changed me. I stopped reacting emotionally to each insult and began thinking strategically about the entire board. I was no longer just trying to survive a hostile workplace. I was preparing for the most consequential negotiation of my career. One in which the thing being defended was not only my income, but the real value of everything I had built. Then the email came. Short. Formal. Immediate. I was instructed to report to a conference room that same afternoon. Not Ethan's office. Not an informal check-in. A conference room, which meant witnesses, stricture, and a prepared script. I looked at the message and felt surprisingly calm. Maybe that was because I had already lived this moment dozens of times in my imagination. I took the resignation letter Rebecca and I had prepared in advance, folded it carefully, and slipped it into my jacket. As I walked down the hallway, I no longer felt like a woman being summoned for judgment. I felt like someone walking into a negotiation the other side did not realize had already begun. Inside the room were Ethan, Mason, Brandon Hayes, and Natalie Brooks from Human Resources. The seating arrangement looked almost theatrical, as if they wanted me placed across from a panel that had already made its decision. Ethan opened with corporate softness, talking about future direction, hard choices, and structural evolution. I listened and thought only this: they had rehearsed their speech, but they had not understood the person sitting across from them. Before I go further, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy stories that expose what really happens behind executive language, because this is the point where their confidence slowly begins turning into panic. I studied each face. Mason pushed the folder toward me with the smoothness of someone expecting quick compliance. Brandon leaned back like the outcome was guaranteed. Natalie kept the neutral expression of an HR professional trained to witness difficult moments without visibly reacting. And me, for the first time in months, I felt my breathing settle into something strong and deliberate. They thought they had arranged the stage. What they did not know was that I had already memorized my lines. When I opened the folder, I found exactly what I expected: two carefully framed paths leading to the same result. I could resign immediately and accept a modest severance payment plus a neutral reference. Or I could be terminated in a restructuring and walk away with essentially nothing. They presented this as choice, but it was really coercion wearing a tie. The part that cut deepest was the pre-written resignation letter waiting inside. It did not simply confirm my departure. It also included language releasing the company and its parent group from all claims related to my employment and separation. In other words, they wanted to buy my silence, my rights, and my history for a sum so small it felt insulting. I stared at that document for a long moment. Not because I was unsure, but because I could feel the weight of everything it erased. More than 2 decades of labor, problem solving, leadership, and sacrifice reduced to a cheap exit package and a legal waiver. I looked up at the faces across from me. They were younger, confident, and almost certainly accustomed to assuming that experience could be outmaneuvered by corporate composure. In that instant, I remembered something my father told me when I got my first job. Never sign anything just because someone in better clothes sounds more certain than you do. That memory settled me. I was not there to beg for mercy. I was there because people with power had decided they could write the ending for me without my consent. And I understood, with perfect clarity, that if I signed their version of my departure, I would be helping them erase the truth. I was not willing to do that, so I lifted my eyes and said, very calmly, that I would write my own resignation letter. The reaction was subtle but immediate. No one exploded. Yet the rhythm in the room shifted. Ethan tried to maintain control by saying they had already prepared language covering everything necessary from a legal standpoint. I answered that a resignation letter was my statement, not theirs. And unless they wanted to openly admit they were dictating the exact words I was allowed to use, I would be writing it myself. Silence followed. They could not forbid me from drafting my own letter without exposing the coercive nature of the entire meeting. At last, they agreed, provided I submitted it before the end of the day. I stood, left the room, and walked back to my office with a calm that almost surprised me. But that calm had been built carefully over weeks. I locked the door, opened my laptop, and stared at the draft. Rebecca and I had polished line by line. We had spent hours debating phrasing, punctuation, sequencing, and implication, because sometimes an employment dispute turns not on emotion, but on the placement of one legally precise phrase. The letter was one sentence. It was short, formal, restrained, and utterly deliberate. No pleading, no speeches, no accusations. Just language designed to do exactly what we intended it to do. I sent it to Rebecca one final time, and her response came back quickly. Still perfect. Send it exactly as written. At that moment, I no longer felt like a woman being pushed out. I felt like someone holding a very small key that could unlock a very large consequence. I printed the letter, signed it in blue ink, and carried it back down the hallway. Each step felt strangely light, as if I had quietly taken back the part of control they assumed they had stolen from me. When I returned to the conference room, they were still there, coffee cups now resting beside their folders, looking like people who believed the unpleasant part was almost over. I handed Ethan the letter without commentary. He skimmed it quickly, barely doing more than confirming that it was signed, and then said HR would process my final compensation. That haste was the hinge on which everything turned. If any one of them had slowed down, if any one of them had truly read instead of assuming, the story might have ended differently. But they did not. The single sentence in my letter stated that my resignation would become effective upon the company's full settlement of all compensation, benefits, equity, reimbursements, and other amounts owed to me under my employment agreement and applicable law. It was not decorative language. It was the entire architecture. It meant that until they paid everything they legally owed, my resignation did not actually take effect. I remained an employee. I retained the rights of an employee. They could not use my letter as proof that I had voluntarily departed while also withholding the obligations that made that resignation effective in the first place. I also pressed them for written confirmation of the payout details, including unused vacation and unreimbursed expenses. They brushed it off with visible impatience, as if I were merely being difficult. I left the room carrying boxes of personal belongings and a phone full of unanswered messages from my team. Yet what I felt inside was not grief or triumph. It was a sharp, quiet stillness. I knew they had accepted something they did not yet understand. And because they did not understand it, I knew the most important part of the story had not even begun. It did not take long. A few mornings later, just after sunrise, my phone rang from an unfamiliar number. On the other end was Daniel Mercer, general counsel for the parent corporation. I knew the moment I heard his voice that someone had finally read the letter properly. He was polite, but the strain beneath the politeness was unmistakable. He asked whether I could clarify the phrase stating that my resignation was effective upon complete settlement. I remember setting my coffee cup down very gently and almost smiling. This was the call Rebecca and I had expected from the beginning. I told him the language was plain. My resignation was conditional. It would become effective only when the company fully satisfied all obligations owed to me under my employment agreement and the law. Until that happened, my resignation had not taken effect, which meant I remained a lawful employee of Northbridge Systems. The silence on his end stretched long enough for me to hear papers moving and low voices in the background. He asked me to repeat myself. I did, even more slowly. I explained it as if I were teaching a basic principle of interpretation that should have been obvious to anyone reading carefully. What made the moment so satisfying was that I had not hidden anything. The meaning had been there in plain text from the start. They simply had not believed that someone like me would be disciplined enough, prepared enough, and bold enough to use contractual language to protect herself. Throughout the call, I never raised my voice. I did not taunt him. I simply explained what the letter meant, and the calmer I remained, the more clearly I could hear the anxiety building on the other side. In that moment, I understood that the balance of power had truly shifted. When Daniel asked what exactly I believed, the company still owed me. I opened the spreadsheet Rebecca and I had prepared and began listing each category with the kind of composure that only comes from knowing your numbers are backed by documents. First, salary owed through the date. My resignation would actually become effective. Then accrued but unused vacation, calculated at my compensation rate. Then unreimbursed business expenses from recent travel. Those 3 items alone formed a substantial sum. But I told him that was only the beginning. My employment agreement also contained a performance bonus provision. And I had not merely met my targets that year. I had exceeded them. That bonus was not discretionary praise. It was contractual compensation. Next came my equity rights. My stock options had accelerated under the change of control language triggered by the acquisition. Then there was the severance protection tied to termination or resignation for good reason within a specified period after that change in control. Finally, I pointed out that statutory interest would continue to accrue if payment was delayed. Every amount I named tightened the silence on the other end of the call. I did not exaggerate. I did not inflate. I did not negotiate from emotion. I simply recited what the contract and the law allowed, and I suspect that was the most frightening part for them. If I had only been angry, they could have waited me out. But I was not speaking from outrage. I was speaking from clauses, dates, formulas, and preserved records. Every year I had remained organized. Every agreement I had saved. Every compensation term I had actually read. Now returned as weight against the very people who assumed I would be too overwhelmed to use any of it. By the time I finished giving him the final figure, I knew they were no longer thinking of me as a woman they had managed to push out. They were thinking of me as a serious legal liability they had activated through their own carelessness. Of course, their first instinct was not to accept reality. It was to resist it. Daniel said my interpretation was absurd, that I could not read the letter in a way that benefited me so heavily. I let him speak. And then I reminded him that this was not just about one sentence in one document. If they wanted to challenge me in court, I was fully prepared for that, because beyond the contract, I possessed something far more dangerous to their position: years of evidence showing how the new leadership treated older, more expensive, more experienced employees. I had internal communications about removing costly senior personnel to improve the cost structure. I had notes from meetings and records of comments suggesting that long-tenured employees were relics who could not adapt. I had timelines showing older workers being forced out and replaced by younger, cheaper hires. I did not need to dramatize any of it. The implication was obvious. Once this moved beyond contract interpretation, it entered the territory of age discrimination, constructive dismissal, and systematic employment abuse. I had spent months staying calm precisely so that when the time came, I could speak from evidence rather than humiliation. When I mentioned that I was working with Rebecca Sterling, a lawyer with deep experience in employment disputes, the line went quiet again. I could almost hear them recalculating what would cost more, paying what I was entitled to, or dragging the matter into discovery and public exposure. What I felt in that moment was not petty delight. It was something closer to stern clarity. They had mistaken my composure for weakness, my age for irrelevance, and my loyalty for passivity. Now they were learning that experience, documentation, and self-respect can be far more dangerous than youthful arrogance in a crisis. Not long after that, Mason called me in a state that sounded much closer to panic than anger. He accused me of trapping them, of being deceptive, of intentionally wording the letter to create confusion. I let him finish before I answered in an even tone. I told him I had not tricked anyone. I had written a lawful document, handed it to them openly, and they had accepted it without reading carefully. If 4 executives and an HR representative sat in a room and failed to notice the most important language in a resignation letter, that was not my wrongdoing. It was their negligence. I also reminded him that if they refused to pay what was owed, then by their own acceptance of that language, I remained employed. That meant salary, benefits, insurance, and all related obligations continued. I remember saying it quietly, but every word landed hard enough that he could not answer immediately. The more interesting thing was that beneath his outrage, I could hear fear. Not moral outrage. Financial fear. Reputational fear. The kind of fear that only appears when someone suddenly realizes the person they dismissed as manageable has become very expensive to ignore. I will not pretend there was no bitterness in me. There was. I had wanted a dignified departure, a fair acknowledgement of a lifetime of work. Instead, they had tried to shove me out as though I were a budget problem. And when someone chooses to treat you like a cost to be eliminated, you are under no obligation to make that process easy for them. During that call, I felt the full reversal of the dynamic. Earlier, they had been the ones delivering ultimatums. Now they were the ones measuring every hour in rising exposure because they had underestimated a woman they assumed would leave quietly. Then came the moment that told me the balance had tipped completely. My company email access was restored. That action said more than any apology ever could. Somewhere in their internal scramble, someone had been forced to admit that if my resignation was not yet effective, then I remained an employee in the eyes of the law. When I logged in again, I found frantic email threads among Ethan, Mason, Brandon, Daniel, and several outside attorneys. Even the subject lines carried a sense of alarm. They had circulated my letter to multiple employment firms, and the responses were remarkably consistent. Conditional resignation. Legally valid. Enforceable. Significant exposure. Reading those words sent a powerful jolt through me. Not because I needed to gloat, but because outside experts with no emotional stake in my story were confirming what I already knew I had been right. All those months of being sidelined, diminished, and treated like an outdated liability were no longer just a private injury. They had become a provable reality with legal consequences. One of the attorney responses made it even plainer, warning that the company likely owed the full contractual amount and faced even greater danger if the dispute expanded into age discrimination claims. I sat there looking at the screen for a long time. There was relief in it, but also sadness. I had once loved that company. I had believed my career would end there in a more honorable way. Instead, the clearest validation of my worth came from lawyers they hired, in desperation to measure how badly they had mishandled me. But justice does not always arrive elegantly. Sometimes it arrives in a chain of panicked internal emails, confirming that the woman they discounted had prepared better than every one of them. That same evening, Daniel called back and said the corporation wanted to discuss a quick and amicable settlement. The word amicable almost made me laugh, considering the way they had cornered me with a forced resignation choice days earlier. Their first number was substantial from an outsider's perspective, but it fell well short of what my agreement actually required. I declined immediately. Then they increased the offer, pushing urgency, trying to create the impression that I needed to decide fast. But the power relationship had completely changed. I was no longer the employee sitting in a conference room facing a panel of executives. They were the ones watching the cost of every passing day rise through salary continuation, interest, legal fees, and the expanding risk of broader employment claims. Rebecca and I stayed firm. Full contractual payment, attorney's fees, written recognition of my performance, and mutual non-disparagement. Or we proceed. I wanted an official recommendation letter because this was not only about money. It was about reclaiming the final record of who I had been inside that company. I would not allow them to buy my silence cheaply and then leave my history blurred or diminished. With each new offer, I could feel the cracks widening beneath their original confidence. They no longer spoke like people fully in control. They spoke like people searching for the least painful exit from a problem they had created through arrogance and haste. And for the first time in months, I no longer felt like I was defending myself from an attack. I felt like I was making deliberate choices from a position of strength. Eventually, they agreed. When Daniel called to confirm that the company would pay the full settlement amount, cover attorney's fees, and provide a formal recommendation letter, I sat in silence for a long time after the call ended. I had prepared myself for a long, ugly war. So resolution felt less like celebration and more like a deep exhale I had been holding for months. The day the funds arrived in my account, I stared at the screen with my hand gripping the edge of the table. It was not only the size of the number that moved me. It was what the number represented. A forced acknowledgement that my years had value. My contract carried weight. And their pressure tactics could not erase either one. That same day, I received the letter on official corporate letterhead, signed by Ethan, praising my dedication, operational leadership, and years of meaningful contribution. Reading it gave me two emotions at once. Bitterness, because the man who had tried to push me out for almost nothing was now signing a document affirming my worth. And peace, because the final written record of my departure would not be whatever story they found most convenient. Rebecca reviewed the settlement papers carefully before I signed. Only after the agreement was executed did my resignation formally take effect. That mattered deeply to me. I did not leave as someone hustled out under pressure. I left only after forcing them to honor what they thought they could strip away with a scripted meeting and a pre-written letter. I never saw that as revenge. I saw it as the only ending consistent with the truth. After I left Northbridge Systems, I watched from a distance as the consequences of their decisions began to unfold. And I felt both sad and unsurprised. The people who believed they could improve operations simply by replacing seasoned employees with younger, cheaper ones soon ran into the one thing they had underestimated. Most institutional memory cannot be rebuilt in a few training sessions. Clients grew frustrated by errors that looked minor individually but accumulated into distrust. Legacy systems started failing in ways that nobody knew could fully diagnose because they did not understand why those systems had been configured the way they were in the first place. Vendor relationships frayed because history matters. And history cannot be downloaded into someone overnight. Former colleagues began reaching out to me one by one. Their stories sounded painfully familiar. They had been isolated, pressured, flattered, or quietly degraded until they were expected to accept terms against their own interests. I connected them with Rebecca. I showed them how to preserve documents, how to read contracts, how to stay calm when people in authority tried to rush them into compliance. Some negotiated strong resolutions. Some remained employed while the company struggled to figure out what they were truly owed. As for me, I entered a different chapter. I took on selective consulting work around operational systems. But the subject people sought me out for most often was not workflow or efficiency. It was defense. How do you protect yourself when a company begins trying to make you disappear? Each time someone asked, my story stopped feeling like a private battle and started feeling like a map. And that made the pain of what happened carry at least some purpose. If there is one thing I want people to carry away from my story, it is not the size of the settlement, and not the satisfaction of watching executives panic after underestimating me. The deepest lesson is about clarity. A workplace can give you salary, identity, routine, and even a sense of belonging. But never let those things make you naive enough to believe an organization will always treat you fairly simply because you have been loyal. Read your contract carefully. Keep your records. Listen closely when people use vague language in formal meetings. And above all, never let someone with a newer title, a louder voice, or more visible power convince you that your value has expired. I once believed my experience would speak for itself. Now I understand that in defining moments, you must be the first person willing to defend that value. Not with reckless anger, but with preparation, knowledge, and resolve. They assumed I would sign the ending they had drafted for me. In the end, I wrote my own. And if you stayed with me all the way to the end of this story, thank you. Thank you for listening, for caring, and for believing that working people deserve protection and respect. Please leave one like and subscribe to the channel so I know stories like this are reaching the people who most need to hear them.